Hi, hello everyone. I'm going to read a article today in the TLS on Francis Bacon's The New Atlantis, a text that's not very well known. And this article actually looks at the connection between Bacon and the tech bros. Now, you'll hear people like Peter Thiel and others whine about safetyism and how safetyism and Greta Thunberg are destroying the world, apparently. But as a matter of fact, what they really want is a total end of history, a corporate state, if ever there was one, on such a massive scale that I don't even know whether utopia, dystopia are still the right kind of concepts. They really want to bring about the end of history. And I think it's striking that their much of their worldview basis really in Francis Bacon, which I'm going to trace here now by help of this article. And before I begin reading this piece, I'd like to just invite you to become a member here on this channel. Maybe also sign up for a course at Halcyon and yeah, maybe support my work also on Substack. But it currently looks as though I am not live on my main channel, which is rather odd. So I may have to come in and come back out again. I don't know why this isn't working. Nope, that's not working. Okay, now it's working, I think. Or maybe not. Oh, it looks like it's working. There must have been an issue somewhere. I don't know what happened. Anyways, today we're going to trace the tech relationship with Francis Bacon and his fever dream of building Salomon's Temple again in the New Atlantis. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend you read the New Atlantis. I also have a couple of long video lectures on Francis Bacon's The New Atlantis on my Substack and also here on YouTube. So before I begin reading this piece in the Times Literary Supplement, just first of all, thank you very much for listening. If you're listening to this live, just leave a super chat if you have a question or a comment, and I'll read those at the end. And before I begin, also, just to let you know, do buy a course at Halcyon Academy. Only, I would, you know, claim it's probably the best and biggest library of online philosophy courses out there. So if you're interested in technology, there's a couple of courses on technology, one on Heidegger, one on the philosophy of the machine, which also includes thinkers like Nick Land, if you are interested in that, or Ernst Jünger and Spengler and others. And of course, there's also spiritual cybernetics, if you're keen on learning about cybernetics, for example. So Peter Thiel, who keeps complaining about safetyism, if you follow the logic that they present all the way to the end, especially in the case of Thiel, it's quite clear that even though he warns against the end of history, he really does want to bring about the end of history, and quite forcefully so. And Bacon's rather uncanny utopia seems to be the blueprint for it. So I'm now going to read from this article. I also highly recommend that you get a subscription of TLS. There's always great articles every week, I think, even. I have a digital subscription, so I just read whatever interests me. So in an earlier volume from the Oxford Francis Bacon Project, which has now produced this edition of New Atlantis, its late director, Professor Graham Rees, called Bacon a genuine midwife of modernity. This, Rees said, was because he was one of the earliest thinkers to imagine a future in which human welfare would be improved through cooperative science. He was a forward-thinking utopian. And as with most utopians, it's hard to avoid a sense of Bacon as a man before his time, waiting often impatiently for the society that would be able to realize his ideas about how science could change the world. And now this is oversimplifying matters, of course, but Bacon did say that we need to torture nature in order to get the results from her that we desire. And I just mentioned this again on my Substack and here for members on YouTube. If you sign up as a member, just $5 a month, there's a couple of really long, in-depth essays or lectures on Bacon's New Atlantis. If you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend you read the text. It's quite uncanny what he's able to discern. He basically describes skyscrapers and airplanes and genetically modified food, etc. He describes a sort of not just a utopia, but really a state of the end of history. And again, this is what Thiel and others, Curtis Yarvin, etc., really want to bring about with themselves as the ruling elves or the philosopher kings or whatever else they can steal in terms of terminology to entice some of the some to believe that they could become part of it. In the years prior to his death in April 1626, as he was writing New Atlantis, Bacon was also quietly arranging his affairs to ensure the legacy he so keenly wished to protect. Still bargaining hard to get back into political favor, he had been impeached in 1621 for allegedly taking bribes while serving as Lord Chancellor. He was looking for the men who could administer his intellectual estate after his death, setting up lectureships in his name, gathering and preserving his private papers, and seeing his final works through the press. The man he chose for this last task was his friend and secretary William Rawley, who called himself Bacon's amanuensis or daily instrument. Rawley would go on to do much to maintain his lordship's reputation, including penning an admiring biography, a task that required, he said, another Homer to be the trumpet of Achilles' virtues. One of the other things that Rawley did was to oversee the publication of New Atlantis, a utopian fable that ended up being appended to Silva Silvarum, Bacon's enormous natural history or collection of scientific observations and experiments. Together, these became his final printed work. Today, New Atlantis is among his best known writings. It has the advantage over Silva of being imaginative and engaging, not to mention brief. They are now almost always printed separately. New Atlantis tells the story of a group of travelers who are shipwrecked in the Pacific Ocean, somewhere near Peru. They are given refuge by the inhabitants of an island called Bensalem, or Bensalem, striking name. And while living there, they learn something of its life and customs, and in particular about Salomon's house, its idealized scientific institution. Salomon's house closely resembles the sort of research organization for which Bacon advocated throughout his career in the power and support it gives to a community of scientists who in turn produce miraculous discoveries and inventions. Now, I should just point out, I won't go into this now here, but in the longer lectures on Bacon here on this channel and on Substack, I do go into some detail on why Salomon is chosen. And I think it's striking that Salomon is at the heart not only of Bacon's fever dream, but also, which is the fever dream we're living through to some extent, and also, of course, the tech bros are, well, let's just say, dwell in the vicinity of that king, figuratively speaking. Salomon's house closely resembles the sort of research organization for which Bacon advocated throughout his career, and the power and support it gives to a community of scientists who in turn produce miraculous discoveries and inventions. This utopian fragment, Raleigh notes that the text was not perfected or finished prior to Bacon's death, seems to have been popular in the 17th century, being quite frequently reprinted. It was quickly absorbed into the group of strange and incongruous works that were becoming known as utopias, works describing seemingly ideal societies that were often viewed, like those of Plato and Thomas More, as being impossible to achieve. If Bacon had any concerns about the longevity of his reputation as he faced the end of his political career, then his life he need not have worried. It took a while because of the nature of what his biographers Lisa Chardin and Alan Stewart have called frequently unsavory career, but later generations accorded Bacon an unimpeachable status as the father of empiricism. In the later 17th century, the Royal Society was modeled on his prescriptions, and his influence on the science and philosophy of the 18th and 19th century was also considerable. He was much beloved of the Enlightenment. Denis Diderot described him as the intellectual forefather of his and Jean Laurent d'Alembert encyclopédie. Voltaire called him the father of experimental philosophy, and Immanuel Kant dedicated his critique of pure reason to Bacon. And Kant, the old Kant, of course, also, well, in some sense, it's even more radical than Bacon because he's not an empiricist so much, but one could say he rides the justification, the philosophical justification, with his logic of transcendental idealism for why the categories of the human mind, by means of the two forms of intuition, time and space, order the manifold of appearances into a organized whole that we would refer to as nature then. So what happens with Kant is that we no longer have access to simplify matters, to what things are in and by themselves. And that matters not anyways for the sciences and for the natural sciences. Quite the opposite matters. What matters for the scientific world access is to be able to produce contradiction-less objects that, if you want to take this a bit further, stand ready for use and consumption, etc. The Victorians also lauded the work of the man whom Thomas Macaulay called the great philosopher who had made new discoveries in moral and political science, and the great apostle of experimental philosophy, and who influenced prominent scholars and philanthropists of the day, including William Whewell and Charles Kingsley. Fittingly, for an apostle, Bacon's later appreciative audience often identified him as a particularly forward-looking figure, one whose work only fully found the fulfillment of its promise decades or centuries after he lived. Nowhere is this more visible than in the New Atlantis. The description of Salomon's house is by far the lengthiest part of this work, teeming as it is with scientific discoveries and achievements. The father or chief scientist of the house reiterates that its many wonders are far superior to anything known by the narrator and his contemporaries. We hold also diverse mechanical arts, which you have not, diverse instruments of music likewise to you unknown, some sweeter than any you have, and so on. Bacon's utopian scientists have achieved miraculous galore, spacious houses where they create artificial rain, snow, and meteors, mixtures of earths that create plants without needing seeds. There you have it, that would be GMO. Baths that cure diseases. Some of these wonders remain beyond human capacity, but others, like the high-powered telescopes and sound houses that generate sounds and music, are now the stuff of fact rather than fiction. Just think of the cinema. So extremely visionary here, of course, as well. It seems to be this forward-looking quality, this apparent reach into the future that has brought, one could of course also refer to churches and their organs, but anyways, it seems to be this forward-looking quality, this apparent reach into the future that has brought Bacon to the attention of a new demographic, US tech bros. And here we are now, where we wanted to be, really, didn't we? We want to understand what the relationship is between this fever dream and the fever dream of Silicon Valley, which is no longer just merely utopian in a sense of how can we order human society in a manner that it is perfectly functional, but goes well beyond that. As a matter of fact, one suggestion is outright to work towards human extinction. A worthy descendant, I think, is the idea, which should be a digital copy of some aspects of human existence as understood by the tech bros, let's just say, people like Peter Thiel, who was one of the early founders, together with InQtel, which is a private equity fund of the CIA. That's all public knowledge. You should know this. If you don't, then you should start reading into this. So Thiel is very much connected to the what people refer to as the deep state. Not at all a libertarian. He says explicitly that being for pro free market is for idiots. Paraphrasing him perhaps slightly here, but he's maintained this rather peculiar image of himself as some sort of libertarian based bro who is really on your side, wink wink. Whereas a matter of fact, the early investment in Facebook was very clearly intended to break down any kind of what was left even of sort of cultural barriers in other parts of the world. And Facebook is the vehicle for this, the vector to achieve that. And so that at the end, we have this Americanized understanding of friendship, where anyone you've ever met is a friend, and where people become ultimately just vassals for for ads, for brand marketing, etc. So in that sense, yes, you could say that's quote unquote libertarian. Anyways, the venture capitalist co-founder of PayPal and tech broligarch Peter Thiel put New Atlantis top of a list of his favorite books as part of a Reddit AMA, saying that he liked the genre of past books written about the future. What a profound statement. There's a genre of past books written about the future. In 2012, he said in an interview that the entire longevity research program is the culmination of the Western scientific project. It was part of Francis Bacon's New Atlantis and has been a recurrent thread through much of the past 400 years of science. Now, this I agree with, and if you haven't listened to it yet, you should listen to it after this stream. I did a stream a couple of days ago on the Immortalization Commission, in which, by the help of John Gray and his book on the Immortalization Commission, I trace the emergence and the origins of transhumanism, which is what Thiel here addresses. So what could be more utopian than using science to defeat death? Now, again, supposedly the tech bros, I mean, especially those tech bros, Thiel and others, and that network are worried about safetyism and the end of history, that the katechon, they use these pseudo-Catholic terms. The katechon doesn't hold. Oh God, the Antichrist is coming, yada, yada. Whereas what they're bringing about clearly, what they wish to bring about clearly, is an end state of history, a deathless end state of history. And they probably think themselves rather close to that. So perhaps it's not surprising that a futuristic utopia would appeal to Thiel, whose book on startups 0 to 1 is subtitled How to Build the Future. That's the funny thing about the future. You don't necessarily just build it. The future that is built has a tendency to slip away from us to a certain extent. So I will not go into this all too much here, but the understanding of time that is betrayed in such a thinking is one which has to assume already an end state, again an eschaton against which as a fixed horizon, and also has to assume ultimately a two-world paradigm where the ordo temporum, the temporal order, is simply just the area which to organize according to the eternal blueprint. So here, the planner, the Homo faber, the tech bro, let's say, the planning human being, the technicized man, takes on the function of God, takes on the function of God and providence, divine providence. So this is, in some sense, hyper modern, if you like, but it's also, funnily enough, anti modern. And it's definitely not as radical as it wants to present itself. It's operating with some very basic ideas, and it doesn't do what is really the genuine task of modernity and has been for centuries to anyone who knows about this. And Thiel should know, he's German actually, that there is a difference between Geschichte and Historie. And that what we have to think is that relationship between, or rather how, Geschichte, or let's just use the English word for ease of understanding, how history as such, history out of history itself, comes to be. Not history in terms of a higher order history or divine providence, or, of course, in this regard, the arrival of AGI, which is all theologically laden language. It's ultimately, again, just a secularization of Christianity, and it doesn't overcome Christianity. It doesn't actually become modern. It does not become avant-garde. It is stuck in the oldest patterns you could imagine. And this again, Bacon explicitly refers to this house of researchers as Salomon's house or Salomon's temple. Let's just face what he's really referring to. Bacon's imaginary scientists have indeed achieved considerable. And by the way, just if you're interested in this, listen to my video on Heidegger, on the abandonment of being and how that relates to Christianity and the notion that the world and everything in it is created. And if you're really keen to read more Heidegger, then take my Heidegger course on Enframing and the Fourfold. So head over to Halcyon and Halcyon Academy and buy a course. And by the way, if you want to leave a comment and you want me to read your comment on this live stream or read your question and answer it, leave a super chat and I'll get back to you at the end. So let's read on here. Bacon's imaginary scientists have indeed achieved considerable success in longevity research with the invention of a water of paradise that achieves the prolongation of life. An experimentation involving resuscitating apparently dead animals with the purpose of finding out what may be wrought upon the body of man. Of course, the father of Salomon's house doesn't go into any detail about how such miracles are achieved. The scientists' processes are kept conveniently secret, both from the wider world and from the narrator of the text. But, as Thiel quite rightly says, transhumanism begins explicitly with Francis Bacon's New Atlantis. So there's some aspect of modernity that's deeply woven together with transhumanism. You could basically refer to this modernity, this trajectory of modernity, as a transhumanist project, which is trying to secularize Christianity, Judeo-Christianity, and does not overcome Christianity and does not take seriously the problem of history, the phenomenon of history as such. It's actually anti-historical, anti-history to the core. It considers history not as singular, unrepeatable, but everything as a repeatable experiment. Hence Facebook. Facebook is, again, the vehicle for it. Don't forget, kids, Thiel was one of the first investors in Facebook. So based, right? As you say when you use internet language. So let's read on here. And let me just point out again, highly recommend everyone getting a subscription to the TLS. The digital subscription is very cheap, very affordable, and there's great articles in it every week. Maybe even get the paper mailed to you every week. So there are other aspects of the scientific achievements of Salomon's house that might also explain why New Atlantis is one of Thiel's favorite books. As an investor in the enhanced games and international multi-sport competition that will embrace the inclusion of science in sports by not requiring athletes to be tested for drugs or other performance enhancers, Thiel might perhaps be interested in Bacon's prototype mixtures for the confirming of it in strength of sinews, vital parts, and the very loose and substance of the body. Sorry, I can't quite make out what this is supposed to be. And drinks that make the very flesh of men's bodies sensibly more hard and tough, and their strength far greater than otherwise it would be. Other reasons why Bacon's utopian scientific institution might appeal to Thiel include its position at the top of Bensalem's social and political hierarchy. Another favorite book of Thiel's, which he has identified. I mean, it's just striking me how conservatives look to Thiel and think that they have found a great supporter of their causes in him. It just I've never been able to understand that. Never. Anyways, another favorite book of Thiel's, which he has identified as one of his greatest influences, is The Sovereign Individual: How to Survive and Thrive During the Collapse of the Welfare State, by none other than Lord, by the way, William Rees-Mogg, who's father of Jacob. Just to mention this. The Sovereign Individual introduced the notion of a cognitive elite, a group of wealthy and skilled individuals who would eventually take over and rule the world, which strikingly, again, contradicts its own claim. So very often what you find with these texts is that the appeal of the book is that everyone is supposed to just pack up and leave, and use. I mean, it's quite, it was published, I think, says here 1997. I think it was published even earlier, written at least earlier, mid 90s, probably earlier, and so again, quite visionary. But the promise is, or the allure is, everyone can be, or many people can become a sovereign individual, which is to say, we back up, we up and leave, we rescind our citizenships and move about, become nomads, and entirely sovereign, because our finances will be basically on a blockchain, we'll be using digital money, etc. But as a matter of fact, is if that in the end, what's suggested in the book, and I did read the book 5 years ago, a cognitive elite takes over, then we're back with probably a shadowy cognitive elite, perhaps, with non-sovereign individuals, with, in fact, a totalitarian system not yet devised. So it is so total or totalitarian, rather. And I find these just obvious contradictions that these people all seem to share, these so-called libertarians all seem to have, quite astonishing. Anyways, a group of wealthy and skilled individuals who will eventually take over and rule the world, right? So instead of trying to end the state, you become the state. It doesn't take much imagination to find a model for these in the rulers of Salomon's house, who enjoy all the trappings of being rich and powerful, as well as public support for their scientific research, and are entirely in control of how knowledge is disseminated and to whom. What I find striking, though, and there's obviously there's a schism here that's not mentioned by the author, which is that Francis Bacon's New Atlantis is an island, and there's certainly a ruling elite, and it would be foolish to assume that there isn't a ruling elite in the West at the moment. There certainly is, even if it's shadowy. But the ruling elite of which Bacon speaks, this is more in line with Plato's Callipolis, with Plato's so-called ideal city, the beautiful city. There's a relationship between the upper and the lower, which is not the case in what Thiel wants to bring about in the Thiel network, and is not the case with what the authors of The Sovereign Individual want to bring about with their cognitive elite. They are divided from whoever they rule over by the power of controlling the information flows. Thiel's interest may bring Bacon closer to, and of course, once, so what, whether you can even be an individual without a universal, that's for another time to discuss. But the idea that you have to prolong life in this frantic manner is you have to prolong your own life just in terms of the number of years that you live. I think becomes more clear why, in terms of the logic that they pursue in their projects. This cognitive elite is sort of in a paranoid manner trying to possess and control information and data flows, as you know, that's Palantir's business model. So it's such a strong paranoiac project based purely on an individual that is divided from the lower part must, of course, extend itself, or else it lapses into itself. It cannot. This kind of individual just cannot trust anyone else to continue the project. Thiel's interest may bring Bacon closer to political power than he has been since his fall from grace as Lord Chancellor in 1626. As a US right-wing power player and dawn of the PayPal mafia, Thiel has close ties to Donald Trump, Elon Musk, and J.D. Vance, having intervened personally with Trump to support Vance's nomination as his presidential running mate. Bacon's desperate efforts to get back in favor with the political administration in the 1620s, when he was imagining scientific miracles in New Atlantis, were not successful in returning him to power. If only he had hung on for another 400 years. This is the point where you'd expect a scholar of Renaissance literature to complain that Thiel has it wrong, and here I am to do just that. His statement that New Atlantis belongs to the genre of past books written about the future makes sense for the feel of scientific discoveries portrayed here. They do seem like, and in some cases have become, the achievements of the future. But Bacon isn't actually writing about the future. He's writing about a far-off island that exists at the same point in time as Stuart England. He is showing how he believes his own society could be if science were properly institutionalized and funded, but the distance he imagines between England and Ben Salem is one of place, not time. David Colclough makes this point when he states in this new edition that while it is true that Salomon's house contains elements of the fantastic, such elements are carefully related to familiar objects, and the implication is that they could be achieved if nature were properly understood and exploited. The point is that Bacon wanted Salomon's house to seem like an institution achievable in the present, not confined to some far-off future. Ben Salem itself, as Colclough points out, is meant to appear attainable. This is also important because nothing else on the island of Ben Salem is especially futuristic. The narrator's encounter with the social practice of the feast of the family, for example, in which a man who has produced 15 or more descendants is thrown a ritualized party, while his partner, the mother, from whose body the whole lineage is descended, stays in the loft above the party room, where she sitteth but is not seen, feels like a good old-fashioned celebration of the patriarchy. Similarly, Bacon's, and so I think this is quite crucial what the author here points out, that regardless, what you think of notions such as the patriarchy, as politically loaded as they are, um, what Bacon describes is a city state or an island state that is self-contained and well governed in the interest of the whole, not in the interest of the few who, in their paranoid ways, are trying to exercise control over what is not theirs and what was not theirs to take from to begin with. The Ben Salemites welcome the travelers because they are Christians like themselves. Bacon is trying to show his reader that an organization such as Salomon's House is fairly immediately possible in the here and now, and his Utopia seems like a revolutionary piece of science fiction only if you read the description of Salomon's House as though it stood alone, which, encouraged by anthologies of utopian literature that exclude the rest of New Atlantis, many readers do. Colclought's deep scholarly new edition of New Atlantis, in contrast, is a testimony to the value of reading both Salomon's House and the work as a whole in context. So before we read on more about this, I'd like to just say that that's all fair, and I think this is important to point out that there's a bit of a perhaps a conception by Thiel and others, etc. And I certainly tend to read this as not a work of science fiction, but as pointing towards the future, because the author's intention, I don't think, matters that much. So it doesn't matter what Bacon was trying to convey to his contemporaries about what's already possible, if only. But what I think is more crucial is what's in the air. So even if Bacon assumed that this would be possible today, if only, science were allowed to roam freely and be unshackled from Christianity, etc., or from the natural order, all good and fair, good, good to know. Thank you. But as a matter of fact, there's something in the air. There's something in the water, to use a bit of a trite metaphor, that describes that we can trace here. That, and this is what Thiel, I think, gets right. That has to do with what modernity is, or what at least one main trajectory of Neuzeit, of new time, of modernity is, of this weird age that refers to itself as modern, as already of the now. Now, the deeper point that you have to, the deeper level that you have to go to, is why Geschichte, why history becomes such a crucial issue for this time, and why, for example, Weltgeschichte, world history, is crucial. And you can't then go back, as Thiel and others do, to distinguishing between ipsa historia and ordo temporarum in good Augustinian fashion, where you distinguish between history as such and in itself, or as still also, by the way, Giambattista Vico does in the New Science. You have to think radically Geschichte on its own. But that's perhaps for another time to discuss, because if you don't, and this is what the tech bros don't, none of them do, it doesn't matter whether they're liberal, left-wing, or right-wing, etc., coded, what they are all working towards is ultimately the end of history, and not just the end of history in a Fukuyamian sense, where we all get along. No, the end of history as an eradication, ultimately as a great extinction event. And that I don't think is, of course, is not in Bacon, but definitely in the thinking of Thiel and others. So let's go on here. For one thing, although the Oxford Francis Bacon project has chosen sensibly to produce Silva Silvarum and New Atlantis in separate volumes, Colclough's commentary shows the value of reading these two works in conversation with one another. In its careful attention to New Atlantis, as material text, the circumstances of its printing in 17th century England and Europe, Colclough's introduction shows the depth of the material connection between New Atlantis and Silva Silvarum. Thinking about this work as a physical object in this way helps us to connect with how it would have been understood by its earliest readers. Despite the fact that they seem different in nearly every regard, for example, almost every experiment described in Salomon's house has an equivalent in Silva Silvarum. Read in this context, as Kolkov argues, this would probably have made Salomon's house very much the main event of New Atlantis. Yet, Kolkov is just as interested in everything that happens around the description of Salomon's house and how this helps us to make sense of it. His meticulous attention to Bacon's use of religious iconography, for example, reminds us that for him and his original audience, the illumination of the intellectual world is dependent upon the direct influence of God. Exactly. But you see, just to go back to what I said before, in some sense, people like Thiel and others are too, but it's just no longer the Christian God. Instead, it is a postulated Godhead that they wish to either to become or produce themselves. But you still have to make a distinction between this temporal order and the supra-temporal order. That's what Thiel still does, and others. Whereas the experience of modernity that we have to take seriously, not just that God is dead, that's a slogan. No, that the metaphysical has collapsed and that instead history, Geschichte, has to be thought radically on its own. That is the task of modernity. That is how you are truly modern. If you want to be accelerationist, that's how you are it. Not by ultimately just turning to some sort of either the Christian God or your own imagined Godhead. So the deep contradiction in Thiel and others is that they fear safetyism, that they fear the end of history, and they do everything in their power to bring about not just safetyism, but radical extinction, and hence the end of history. But in a way that goes well beyond the last man. It is a radical extinction event. It is bringing about the apocalypse, Judgment Day. So it is anti-modern ultimately to the core, um, what they're doing. They're not proper accelerationists either. Bacon's emphasis on the religious nature of scientific activity in Ben Salim may feel like so much contemporary detail for the modern reader, but even 17th century readers would have been struck by his careful insistence on the proximity of God and godliness to scientific activity. This is a highly contemporary aspect of the Utopia that may also get lost if we take its idealized research institute out of context. New Atlantis, as Colclough shows, is a call to arms to Bacon's fellow natural philosophers and a bid for science to be funded and supported, but like many utopias, it complicates its own seemingly ideal nature. So this is basically just a political point. This is trying to or trying to argue that show that Bacon tried to get funding for science and what perhaps could be possible, so it's imaginative, etc., and may perhaps convince the powers that be, let's just say, to fund the sciences more, but or the natural philosophy as it was referred to at the time. But and I wouldn't even think of it so much as a, you can think of it as a utopia, if you think of utopia as a non-place, but the way we, so this is, being good historians, the author here of this piece, of course, reads Bacon very much in the context of his time. I don't. I read Bacon much more in line with how Thiel would read Bacon, simply because what Bacon here does is of course, in hindsight, that's post factum, post horror, we can see though that again there's something in the air that makes modernity, but also once you start articulating what is or might or could be or could come to be, once you start doing that, you are also altering, not entirely changing or transforming, but you're altering, you're impacting on the course of history, on the very trajectory that life or history or the world, let's just say, is going to take. So this is where I might disagree perhaps with the author of this piece, but it's good to understand, of course, what Bacon's own context was. In New Atlantis, much of this complication is to be found in the context in which Bacon's imagined science takes place. With regards to Salomon's house itself, Colclough points out that its description is a testament to the scale of the enterprise Bacon had in mind, that is to say, enormous, and its need for external funding. Despite the fact that science and Bensalem requires extensive support of this nature, knowledge within the society is divulged magisterially top down. The activities, well, yeah, that's still how it works today. I don't know why you think it doesn't. The activities of Salomon's house are kept, which is, by the way, also why this notion of quote unquote the cathedral is misleading. The activities of Salomon's, because the cathedral, if you even want to refer it as such, is of course funded. It doesn't operate on its own. The activities of Salomon's, maybe it should better be called Salomon's Temple. The activities of Salomon's house are kept entirely secret from the general public. Even the narrator doesn't get to see what actually goes on inside. And whenever the public are seen as a group, they are silent and reverential spectators. In its representation of a quiet, biddable, awestruck populace, New Atlantis presents an image of the relationship between scientific activity and the society in which it takes place. It was as much as a fantasy in Bacon's time as it is in our own. Utopias are often criticized for being too static, too unreal, too keen on smoothing out the problems of real life, and of course, this utopian fable is no different in this regard. In New Atlantis, the things Francis Bacon left out, politics, for example, or one can't help but notice women, may be significant as the things he put in. Those absences might give a moment's pause to anyone who reads Salomon's house as an idealized vision of times to come. So this is, I think, is a crucial point. Yes, we shouldn't read this as a utopia that's describing what's to come. But again, that doesn't mean that once those ideas in an articulated manner begin to circulate, that they don't take on a life of their own and begin to, in ways that we cannot possibly hope to see, even, in causal terms, even just in terms of correlation, etc., those ideas fester, they travel, and they can spring up again in a place that for many is the new Atlantis, America, One of the greatest expressions for it is California and Silicon Valley, where the impossible is being made possible. So it while all of this is relevant to understand the context of it, it matters not so much, because what really matters is how these ideas, once articulated, begin to circulate, and indeed 400 years later have this tremendous impact. Because clearly Silicon Valley is not free of ideology or a certain will to power. And clearly many are not perhaps entirely clear about what it is that they believe. Again, I've said this before. If you listen back, there is in this live stream, I mean, there is a certain there is a need to assume a certain theology in so much of what's going on in Silicon Valley, in AI especially, where they have to either postulate or even work towards producing a godhead to have an order outside of time against which the temporal order is supposed to be structured. So David Colclought's, and I hope I'm probably pronouncing this badly, but anyways, Colclough's immaculately presented and highly accessible text, including its detailed commentary and bibliography, help us keep New Atlantis in perspective. So, very good piece here again in the TLS. And I'll just say, in the end, that the inherent contradictions in the tech bros worldview are blatant. If they're so obvious, you don't have to dig very deep to see them. And I've pointed some of them out here. But the biggest danger is that what they're working towards is clearly an extinction level event. And the production of a godhead for the sake of bringing about Judgment Day. All right, so thank you very much for listening. Make sure that you subscribe, like, share this video, turn on notifications, and become a member on this channel. And of course, also head over to Halcyon Academy and buy a course, support the work on this channel in this manner. There is also a reading list you can download if you want to know what texts to read in philosophy, what I would recommend everyone to read. All right. Thank you.